Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Machiavelli's Discourses. We're still examining in Book 2 of Discourses. Today we're looking at chapter 17. Now 17 continues the theme. He's now addressing the question of artillery, right? Because last week he talked about the wars and why the ancient orders, why the ancient orders are beating the modern orders, and what is so bad about contemporary Italian warfare and what they were doing wrong, Christians were doing wrong. And he dealt with it, and he ends it by suggesting that, well, maybe the thing that they're excusing is saying that the artillery plays such a bigger role, and the artillery just totally changes the game. Now, in this chapter, he addresses this: how much artillery should be esteemed by armies in the present times, and whether the opinion universally held of it is true. Okay, so that's the question of whether it's, is it true? When I was considering, besides the thing written above, how many fights I in the field and in our times called with a French word days, right? Again, not literally a French word, but a Gallicism, an Italian word, Gionate, Gironate, used on the mode of the French journeys, which everywhere we translate along with the battaglia as battles, right? So therefore, this is the playing on the French, right? Playing on language. He says in the field where the French word days, by which the Italian and by the Italians' feat of arms were waged by the Romans in different times, there came into my consideration the universal opinion that of many who would have it that if there had been artillery in those times, the Romans would not have been permitted, or not so easily, to take provinces and make people pay tribute to them, as they did, nor would they in any mode have made such mighty acquisitions. They also say that by the means of those firearms, men cannot use or show their virtue as they could in antiquity. So therefore, one, that they would not have been able to wage the wars that they did, and also two, firearms doesn't allow men to show their virtue as they did in antiquity, and they add a third thing, that one comes to battle with more difficulty than one came to it, and that one cannot keep there to the orders of those times, so that war will in time be reduced to artillery. So in other words, that you can't bring in there the orders of those times, because so that war will be reduced to artillery. In other words, in that sense, that the difficulty, in other words, coming to battle with the equipment and stuff, and it's going to be completely different. Okay. Judging it not to be outside the purpose to dispute whether these opinions are true, how much artillery has increased or diminished the force of armies, and whether it takes away or gives opportunities to good captains to work virtuously, I shall begin to speak to their first opinion, right? So you're going to start the first opinion, which is what? That artillery changes the game, right? That they would not have been able to do what they did, conquer, making the submissions. I shall begin to speak of the first opinion, that the ancient Roman armies would not have been able to make the acquisitions they made if they had been artillery. Responding to that, I say war is made either to defend oneself or to take the offense. So he says, I'm responding that war is either to defend oneself or offense. Hence, to first be examined, it is to which of these two modes of war is more useful or more harmful. So, to make defense, which is more useful and which is more harmful. Although there may be something to say on each side, nevertheless I believe, without comparison, it does more harm to whomever defends himself than to whomever takes the offensive. In other words, it's more costly more harm to oneself to defend oneself than to go on the offensive. The reason I say this is that whoever defends himself either is inside a town or is in a camp beside a stockade. If he is inside a town, either this town is small or as are the large part of the fortresses, or is great. In the first case, he who defends himself is altogether lost. For the thrust of the artillery is such that no wall is found, however thick, that it does not knock down in a few days. And if he who is inside does not have good spaces to withdraw into, with trenches and embankments, he is lost. In other words, again, he says that, okay, the terms like embankments and barricades in this chapter are rendered as dikes and dams in Prince 25, right? They're like the dikes and dam in chapter 25. The terms translated as embankments and barricades in this chapter are rendered as dikes and dams, right? In Prince 25, a lot of fortune. Okay, yeah. The metaphor in Prince 25 is that fortune is a river going like this, and that the dikes and dams are the things that you can control fortune by. For the river, control the forces of the river, right? So the embankments and the things the trenches and the embankments are like that. They are the means to control the force of the not nature but artillery. Nor can he stand up against the thrust of the enemy who tries to enter through the breach into the walls. Nor does the artillery he may have help him in this. For it is a maxim that when men cannot go in mass and with a thrust, artillery cannot stand up against them. So for a maximum, where men can go in mass and with a thrust, artillery cannot stand up against them. Therefore, it's act maxim that there's no way that artillery can just get so big and just overrun you. And therefore, the defenses of towns and the ultramontane furies are not stood up to. Italian assaults are stood up to well since they are led into battle. Since Italian assaults are stood up to well since they are led into battle, which they call by a very appropriate name of skirmishers, not in mass but in small groups. Those who go with such disorders and coldness against a breach in a wall where there is artillery go to a manifest death, and artillery shall avail against them. But when those who are compacted en masse, with one shoving the other, go against the breach, they are not sustained from the trenches or embankments. They will enter in every place, and artillery does not hold them. And if some of them die, they cannot be so many that they impede the victory. In other words, even if some die, there'll be still more that the ones who die will not impede the victory. This has been known to be true from many stormings performed by the ultramontanes in Italy, especially that of the Brescia. For when that town rebelled from the French, and the fortress was still held for the King of France, the Venetians, so as to sustain the thrust that they could come from it against the town, provided the whole street that descended from the fortress to the city with artillery, putting it in the front and on the flanks and every other appropriate place. Monsieur Dufour took no account of this. Instead, with his squadron dismounted on foot, he passed through the middle of it and seized the city. Nor is it heard that he received any memorable harm from it. So whoever defends himself in a small town, as was said, will find the walls on the ground and does not have any space for embankments and trenches to withdraw to. He has to trust in artillery and has to trust in artillery is lost at once. In other words, if he's only a small town and he has no walls, no defense, no embankments and trenches to withdraw to, he has to trust in artillery, and in doing so, he's lost. This is easy to deal with. If you defend a great town, and you have the advantage of being able to withdraw, artillery is nonetheless, beyond comparison, more useful to whomever is outside than to whomever is inside. So therefore, if you're defending the big thing, it's more useful outside than inside. First, because of the artillery. Because for artillery to hurt those who are outside, you have to be compelled of necessity to raise it above the level of town. For if you stay at that level, any little barricade and an embankment the enemy makes remains secure, and you cannot hurt them. Since you have to lift or pull yourself up onto the walkway of the walls, or in whatever mode raise yourself above the ground, you draw to yourself two difficulties. First is that you cannot bring the artillery of the massiveness and power that anyone can bring from the outside, since you are not able to manage great things in small spaces. So, in other words, you can't bring the same size artillery. You can't, because the space issue. Inside the fort, you have to deal with not the same size guns, because of, can't manage them in small spaces, right? The other is that if you can actually bring it there, you cannot make it faithful and secure the embankments for saving said artillery that those outside can make. In other words, he's saying that the outside things can make, embankments. In other words, you cannot make faithful and secure embankments for saving said artillery that those outside can make. So in other words, in that they are on terrain and have the advantage in the space that they themselves wish, so much that it is impossible for whomever defends a town to keep artillery high places when those who are outside have very much and powerful artillery. And if they have to come into a low place with it, it becomes a good part useless, as was said. So the defense of the city has to be reduced to defending it with one's arms, upper limbs, bracha, and weapons, not weapons. In other words, they have to defend it with arms, lifting things up, right? With one's arms, as when done in antiquity, and with light artillery. And if little utility is observed with respect to light artillery, a disadvantage is obtained from it that counterbalances the advantage of artillery. For thanks, with respect for, in other words, respect, for thanks to it, the walls of the town are kept low and almost buried underground in trenches, so that when it comes to hand-to-hand battle, either because the walls are beaten down or because the trenches are filled up, he who is inside has more disadvantage than he had before. And so, as was said above, those instruments which helped him who besieged towns much more than him who is besieged. In other words, the artillery is not that useful to besiege. It hinders you more. And he says, even the thing that because all the ways you had to use it always makes you weaker or more vulnerable. And a third thing, being reduced to a camp inside a stockade so as not to do battle if it is not to your convenience or advantage. Being reduced to a camp inside a stockade so as not to do battle if it's not in your convenience or advantage. I say that in this situation, you ordinarily do not have any remedy with which to defend yourself from combat other than what the ancients had. And sometimes on account of the artillery, and sometimes on account of artillery, you are at a greater disadvantage. For if the enemy comes upon you and has a little advantage from you, a little advantage from the country, as can easily happen, and finds himself higher than you, or if on his arrival you have not yet made your barricades or covered yourself well with them, he dislodges you at once, and without your having any remedy, you are forced to go out of your fortresses to come and fight. This happened to the Spanish at the Battle of Ravenna, where they had dug in between the Orinoco River and the barricade, because they had not raised it high enough, and the French had little advantage in the terrain. They were constrained by the artillery to go out of their fortresses to come fight. But given that the place you have taken for a camp is, as it is often must be, more eminent than others opposite it, and that the barricades are good and secure, so that by means of the site, you and your other preparations, the enemy does not dare to assault you. In this case, one will come to those modes that one came to in antiquity, where individuals who, with his army on the spot that could not, with his army in a spot that could not be attacked, these are to overrun the country, to take or besiege town friendly to you, and to impede your supplies, so much that you will be forced by some necessity to dislodge or to come to battle, where artillery, as was said before, does not work much. Whoever considers thus what types of war the Romans made, and sees how they made almost all their wars, taking the offensive against others and not defending against them, will see that if the things said above were true, that they would have had more advantage and would have made their acquisitions more quickly if they had been artillery in those times. In other words, and if they had artillery, because they were the aggressors in the way they were more active and aggressive, offensive war, they were, in other words, that his idea is that, so he argues that the artillery for defensive is a losing proposition, because what, you build it in fortress, in other words, the fortresses and things like that. You'd have to be, in other words, the argument here is that you'd have to be not in fortresses, and you have to be able to have mobility in that sense. But most people at this time chose fortresses, right? This idea, or defending cities within cities. 4. So therefore, he addresses two critiques. In other words, he accepts their argument, but and makes the argument counter to them by accepting the way they fought. They fought just like in this specific city. They fought for the city, and they stuck in that. And therefore, this is the way you do this. And therefore, you're attacking cities. Well, therefore, the attacker will have the advantage. As to the second thing, that by means of artillery men cannot show their virtue, as they showed in antiquity. I say it is true that men incur more danger than back when they had to show themselves in small groups, when they had to scale a town or make similar assaults, when they were not confined together but had to appear by themselves one by one. It is true that captains and heads of armies are subject to more danger to the danger of death than back then, since they can be reached with artillery in every place. Nor does it help them to be in the last squadron and be provided with very strong men. Nevertheless, both the one and the other of these two dangers dangers rarely inflict extraordinary harm, since well-protected towns are not scaled or assaulted with weak assaults. But when one wishes to capture them in the affair, the affair is reduced to a siege, as was done in antiquity. And even in those that are captured by assaults, the danger are not much greater than they are back then. For whomever defends towns in that time also did not lack things to shoot with, which is that they were not so furious. In other words, they did not lack things to shoot with, which, if they were not so furious, had a similar effect to killing men, like the darts and things like this. Right? He says, as to the death of captains and condottieri, the mercenaries, right? There are a few examples of them in the 24 years presumably counting the invasion of Charles V in September 1494 to 1517 or 1518, right? 24 years. Back then, they retreat artillery. Oh, I missed my place. Where? Note 5 for, where is note 5? Okay, I'm a little lost. Yeah, here it is. There's note 5. Sorry, I apologize. It's just text got lost for a second. As to the deaths of the captains and commandants, there's been few examples. There are few examples of them in the 24 years than the wars that have lasted in the recent times in Italy, than there were in the 10 years of time of the ancients. For aside of Count Ludovico di Mirandola, so Count Livy, who died at Ferrara when the Venetians assaulted that state a few years ago, right? This is, again, 1509, Art of War, right? The Duke of Norms, who died at Shiragula, Siraigunula, 7, which is 1507, Art of War. The Duke of Nemours is Louis of Armagnac, not Gaston de Foix, whose death is mentioned in the latter sentence. Right? It did not occur that any of them have died from artillery, for Monsieur de Fleur died at Ravenna, a different person, from steel, not from fire, right? This is Guardini, History of Italy, right? So if men do not particularly demonstrate their virtue, it arises not from artillery, but from the bad orders and weakness of armies. For lacking virtue in the whole, they cannot show it in the part. In other words, his argument here is that it's not that the artillery is so great, it's that the discipline of soldiers and the discipline of order, that they're in other words, they're individually, in other words, their virtue in terms of their larger organization and their way they fight and the way they discipline themselves is the problem. Whereas most Italian militaries are mercenaries, small units. And therefore their way of fighting is completely different. But therefore it's not that, in other words, for the lacking virtue in the whole, they cannot even show it in its parts, right? As now to the third objection, right? As to the third thing they say, one cannot get hand to hand, that one can not get hand to hand, and that war will be continued altogether by Italy. I say this opinion is altogether false, and thus will always be held. So again, Machiavelli starts saying that it's not going to change. Artillery is not going to be this overall thing that destroys this. He goes, in other words, for it suits whomever wishes to make good army to accustom his men exercises either feigned or with true to get close to the enemy, and to have him yielding his sword, and to stand chest to chest with him. And one ought to find oneself more on infantry than on horse, for the reasons that will be said below. In other words, infantrymen. If one finds oneself on infantrymen and on the modes said before, artillery becomes altogether useless. For getting close to the enemy, infantry can flee in the blows of the artillery with more ease than in antiquity could they flee the thrust of the elephants and scythe chariots and other unaccustomed opponents the Roman infantry opposed, against which they always found the remedy. In other words, infantry can always find, as the infantry found a remedy against the scathed weapons and chariots and elephants, they will find a remedy against artillery, he says. And which they always found a remedy. So much more easily they have found it against artillery, in so much as the time during which it can hurt you is briefer than during which elephants and chariots can hurt you. In other words, again, this is the point. Okay, anyone who knows warfare knows that in the artillery, the infantryman found response to the artillery is to deep, go down, go in the dirt, dig holes, things, and put and have protection of the trenches, entrenchments. Why? The artillery has to. The only way it kills you is if it hits directly on your hole. And since you're low, the fragmentations and those things are going to be far less there. It's going to be the shock and the wear of that. Infantry, this is this, you see warfare, the same thing is going on in the, artillery is a big thing. It prevents, in fact, the artillery is worse when troops are out in the field, right? They're crossing, when they're making the attack, and that's when they're vulnerable, and that's when, and if they're in the open, the artillery then can do it. And only by moving fast can you avoid moving fast and being able to, avoid it in that sense, right? That's the way you address it, artillery in that sense. They found it so much more easily. They found it against artillery than their times of these things, really. And for the latter disordered you in the middle of the fight, while the former may impede you only before the fight. And infantry easily escapes this implement when they shoot either by seeking cover from the nature of the site or by lowering themselves on the ground when they shoot, right? Even this is seen by experience not to be necessary, especially to defend yourself from heavily artillery, which cannot easily be balanced in such a mode that it does not either go high and does not find you, or go low and do not reach you. When the armies then get hand to hand, it is clear that it is clearer than light that neither heavy nor small ones can hurt you. Again, 9 offends, right? Offends you, hurts you, offends you. For if they have the artillery in front, it becomes your prisoner. And if it's in behind, it hurts, harms, offends their friends rather than you. On the flanks, shoulders, right? On the shoulders, it cannot wound you as in such a mode that you cannot go and encounter it. And from that will follow the said effect, right? You're right in there. Nor is this much disputed. For one sees the example of the Swiss, who at Nervina in 1513 went without artillery and without horse to meet the French army, and was provided with artillery inside its fortress, and broke it without suffering any impediment from them. And the reason is, beside the things said above, as for artillery to be able to work, it needs to be guided by walls and trenches or by barricades. And if it lacks one of these guardians, it becomes a prisoner or useless, as happens when it has to be defended by men, which happen in battle and fights in the field, right? That becomes easily. By the flanks, it cannot. On the flanks, it cannot be put to work except in the mode that ancients put to work shooting instruments, right? Which they put outside their squadrons so they could engage in combat outside their ranks, and whenever they were shoved back by cavalry or others, their refuge was behind the legions, right? They went behind the legions, and that's it. Whoever counts on it otherwise does not understand it well. You can't decide, in other words, if you're relying on artillery, you don't understand it well, he's saying. It's like these instruments, that shooting instruments, that they put outside their squadrons. They shoved back, whenever they were shoved back by cavalry and others, their refuge was behind the legions. Whoever counts on it otherwise does not understand it well, and trusts the thing that can easily deceive him. In other words, artillery can easily deceive you, thinking you're better than you are, you're safer than you are. And if the Turk has had victory over the Sofi and the Sultan by means of artillery, right? This is again Selim the First defeated Ismail the First, the Pasha of Persia, at Calderon in 1514, and the Malmadouk Sultan of Egypt in Aleppo in 1516, near Cairo 1517. The term Sofi comes from the family name of the dynasty ruling Persia from 1500 to 1736, right? In other words, that the Turk had victory over that, and the Sultan by means of artillery. It arose not from any virtue of it other than the fright that the unaccustomed noise put into their cavalry. In other words, the cavalry, the ancient cavalry they had, the artillery just made their cavalry they weren't used to it. They weren't accustomed, and horses are like this. And these soldiers, the Sultan and these were not infantry soldiers. They were cavalry. That's another point. And I think he's trying to say that cavalry can be easily done in by this, because they frightened the horses. And the horses... there. Coming to the end of discourse, I therefore conclude that artillery is useful in the army when ancient virtue is mixed with it, but without it, against a virtuous army, it is useless. In other words, if you're well ordered and your army has been trained properly and virtuous and knows how to handle it, you can defeat against it. So therefore, it's useful when it's mixed with a virtue, but without that, against a virtuous army, it is useless. So we'll stop here. If you have any comments or questions, please put them below, and I'll respond to them when I see them. Again, if you have, this has been a very interesting chapter from this tactical. I mean, many people say, well, isn't artillery stronger? No, he's saying that it can be addressed, and that you know how to address it by virtue, good discipline and organization. You can deal with it. It is not the ground-changing thing that the advocates of it argue. He addressed all three of their arguments, and he suggests again that it's overstated. Its claims are overstated. So please put your comments there, and I'll respond to any of them who gives it. Next thing is if you like it, hit the like button. Please hit the like button. It helps with the algorithm and things like this. If you share it, share it on your friends, share it to someone who you think be interested in this. Share it far and wide. Another thing you can do is you can, if you've not subscribed, please subscribe and consider subscribing. Encourage others to come check out the channel. Encourage your friends to come check not only the video series of what we're doing now, Machiavelli's Discourses, but the other examinations of the prints that we've dealt before, or the others playlists on Aristotle or Thucydides, or anything else that I've dealt with in the various series of texts we've looked at and examined over the time since we started doing this steadily since 2020. I hope you will do all these things. You know, subscribe, comment, subscribe, like, share. Why? Because all those things, any of these activities, help the algorithm. It adds to the algorithm, and that way, when people are searching for Machiavelli, I want to find something on Machiavelli's Discourses, this will come up. So please help us bring it to the attention of others. If you didn't like it, if there's something I didn't like, or you interrupted too many times, well, please put the comments in there, and the negative comments, criticisms in there, and as a comment. You can always thumbs down, but please, if you're going to do that, explain why. What is the specific issue, and people can learn from it otherwise, if it has some merit in that sense. Another thing we can do is, if you want to know more about me, you can follow the social media links below. If you want to know, or follow me on social media in that sense. Or if you want to know more about me as a scholar, researcher, and check out my academic publications and stuff like that, you can check out the links below, the social media links. Or if you want to contribute to what I do, help financially in that sense, you can do so through Patreon or Subscribe Star. Links are below. Or you can do so by buying one of my books. The available books are currently listed below, and they are available. You can either maybe order through your local bookstore, of course, but through an online distributor like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Book Depository, Libris, and so forth, or directly through the publishers. And there's an ebook that's currently available on Kindle and other things. I think even my Yellow Shoe book is available on Kindle, and some of the other books themselves are available as ebooks as well. So please go check them out and do help in that sense. And last but not least, that's it. We'll go today. We'll turn to the next video, I think 18. So take care and have a nice day. Bye-bye.